I have this kind of framework that I talk through. It starts with the problem. The problem to me is the bedrock, the foundation that any business is built on. It's the fulcrum that you set your lever up against, and the lever is the business. Without a problem, there is no opportunity to create value, because value is created in the solving of a problem, and it's proportional to how severe and expensive that problem is. And so I think way too many founders, and myself included, I've made this mistake so many times. We jump forward to solutions and we get excited about our solution. We get excited about our product. We get excited about what we want to build. And we lose sight of what the point is, which is to solve a problem for people. And that being essentially the oil well that we're trying to tap into. And so maniacal focus on a problem and trying to become the best in the world at solving that problem. The second level up from that is a point of view, right? So becoming maniacally focused on developing a compelling point of view and a really deep understanding of why does this problem actually exist? So once you understand you have a problem, once you understand a point of view on why it exists and how to do it better, do you actually have a set of steps? Do X, Y, Z in this order, and the problem gets solved consistently in a way that works for people, in a way that creates value. And only then do you start focusing on the product, the solution, the software, the service, the marketing, the sales. Like, that's, to me, the real, if you're at the very early stages, the real focus, the real sequence. And the more focused, the more maniacal, the more obsessed I've seen entrepreneurs be about those things in that order, the faster they've become successful.
I am super excited for today's guest, Marcel Petitpas, a good friend of mine who I met through Dan Martell's coaching program, SaaS Academy. Marcel is the head coach, working very closely with Dan Martell. In addition to this, Marcel is the co-founder of Parakeeto. This is a platform that specializes in helping agencies understand their numbers and become more profitable. He's also a co-author of the best-selling book with Dan Martell, Software as a Science. Marcel is an international keynote speaker and is largely viewed, if you do any research around the internet, as a foremost expert on agency profitability. So without further ado, please welcome my good friend, Marcel Petitpas, to the show, man. Thank you for joining us on the $1 Million Agency Podcast.
Patrick, I feel like $1 million being on the $1 Million Agency Podcast. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Marcel, I know who you are, but I want to give you the opportunity to share the brilliance and like push you to brag a little bit on how you got to where you are and what is it you do, Marcel?
Well, my day job is I run this company called Parakeeto, and we are the world's first integrated profitability management consulting firm. And so what that means in English is we help agencies measure and improve their profitability in a way that actually looks across finance, operations, and sales, and kind of brings those things together in a way that's easy to understand and in a way that really gives you a full picture of what's going on in the business. Started that company about 6 years ago. We've been successful with it, helped hundreds of agencies around the world through our consulting and thousands more through our content and free tools. And in a separate life, I've also been involved in this organization where we met called SaaS Academy, where I've coached over 1,000 B2B software founders and also had the privilege of publishing a book, which is right over my shoulder here, Software as a Science, with 3 of my close friends, Dan Martell, Johnny Page, and Matt Verlack, and became a best-selling author. So those are kind of some of the highlights, and have been an entrepreneur for over a decade. Have had many, many failures along the way, including the first few years at Parakeeto. They were not easy. And so just like everybody else, I've got my battle scars, but I'm very fortunate to have found some success along the way as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important the way that you frame this and set this up, because being an entrepreneur is not easy. And when we first start out and we take some lumps, it could be natural to think that, like, hey, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. Maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe I don't have what it takes. But I think what decides whether you have what it takes or not is whether you continue on, because we all have those. We all have those scars. Any entrepreneur that's reached a level of success, would you agree that we just kind of collect those along the way?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, even when you hear the stories of the companies that grow really, really fast, I've kind of said this in the past. It's like, not growing sucks, but growing sucks too. It's just different, right? It comes with all of these different challenges. So every once in a while, you hear the story of even these entrepreneurs that seem like they have a horseshoe up their ass. They start their first business. It becomes gigantic. It becomes Snapchat, and they're like 18 years old running $1 billion company. But even that comes with challenges, and there's all kinds of mistakes. And so I think it's just kind of a rite of passage. And this really is like the ultimate personal development exercise, is scaling a business and leading people.
I 100% agree. The law of the lid says that we can't grow beyond the skill set of the leader. And if you're just constantly forced as you run a business to be leveling up and being self-aware enough to reach out for additional resources, which is what led me to you with SaaS Academy. And you've worked hand in hand with Dan Martell for years and years. And I know that you guys have built a close friendship. And through that SaaS Academy vehicle, you've been able to look at this and look at companies go from struggling to successful at probably more, like you've seen more reps of this than most of us ever get exposed to. And I'd love to just kind of like hit on that a little bit, and how has Dan influenced you in this business growth that you've had, and what have you seen the mistakes that other people have made that he's helped out with?
We could spend the entire podcast talking about the ways in which Dan has influenced me and helped me become successful. I feel fortunate every day that for some reason that I still can't quite put my finger on, one day he just kind of decided that he was going to open doors for me and bring me into the fold. But I would say the three biggest things that I've learned from Dan are, number one, a lot of people think that like they see where Dan is today in his personal brand, especially, and in his entrepreneurial career, but I knew him a long time ago, and he's made a lot of mistakes just like every other entrepreneur. What I admire most about him is the speed with which he's able to take the lump, shift his perspective, learn from it, and get better is beyond anything I've ever seen. I've never met anybody that's able to learn from mistakes as quickly as he can. And he, this is a thing that he always say, first mistakes only, no second mistakes, right? He's like, anybody can make a mistake once, but it's if you do it 2 or 3 times that it becomes a problem. And he really lives that. So that was a big thing. The second thing is just the relentless energy and focus that he has. I've never seen somebody who can set a target, set a goal, reverse engineer what other people have done to accomplish that goal, and then do whatever is required to get there and never miss a day. And you would think that, again, you see where he is today. Oh, he's not doing the grunt work. He's not making the cold calls. He's not doing the sales calls. He's not spending the 12 hours a day doing this, that, and the other thing. But like, I've seen him do all of those things relentlessly.
He wasn't born into it
Today. He absolutely not. Quite the opposite, right? He came from a really difficult situation and built himself from nothing. And so being that close to that kind of energy and discipline has been incredibly inspiring. And I think all of that is wrapped up in just this maniacal pursuit of personal development and growth. And again, like over the 10 years that I've known Dan, I've seen him grow in so many incredible ways, and not just in his strengths, also in areas that he struggled with. And so, we could talk about the tactics and the strategies and those kinds of things, but when you translate that to coaching, like being on the side of the coach, helping other entrepreneurs, the focus and the discipline have been the 2 biggest determining factors in success. I could tell you that a lot of the most successful founders that I've met definitely did not have the highest IQ, definitely did not have the most money, definitely were not doing the most advanced, fanciest tactics. Most of them were just focused on doing the right things at the right time and had enough discipline to make sure that they actually did them consistently. And that is, I think the most important ingredient, and the thing that underneath all of the success that you see Dan have, those are the underlying, I think, habits, behaviors, traits, whatever you want to call them, that have really actually turned all the things that he's done into a success.
Yeah. What's really inspiring about this is it's things that we can do to be successful, right? If it was just based on, hey, I see the people with the highest IQ, the smartest ones, the ones that have the most education, that will like, hey, I want to be in the NBA, but I'm 5'2". Like, I can't do that. But with this stuff where it's coming down to discipline and kind of execution, well, we can all plug that in. And I mean, hey, we could sit here and have a whole podcast about Dan, but like, if Dan gets the opportunity to be on this podcast, and we'll have that conversation. This is Marcel's podcast, right? So I want to frame this in more of like what Marcel has, the commonality that you've seen, not just from working with Dan, but working with the companies that as a part of like SaaS Academy, that you've mentioned this, the discipline and kind of like reverse engineering this stuff. Is there anything else that you could share to these kind of up and coming entrepreneurs that from being in the agency space that maybe they need to hear?
Yeah. Focus. It just comes down to one word, which is focus. And then it's just a question of the different apertures at which you apply that word. And so, I have this kind of framework that I talk through. It starts with the problem. The problem to me is the bedrock, the foundation that any business is built on. It's the fulcrum that you set your lever up against, and the lever is the business. Without a problem, there is no opportunity to create value, because value is created in the solving of a problem, and it's proportional to how severe and expensive that problem is. And so I think way too many founders, and myself included, I've made this mistake so many times. We jump forward to solutions and we get excited about our solution, we get excited about our product, we get excited about what we want to build, and we lose sight of what the point is, which is to solve a problem for people. And that being essentially the oil well that we're trying to tap into. And so maniacal focus on a problem and trying to become the best in the world at solving that problem. The second level up from that is a point of view, right? So becoming maniacally focused on developing a compelling point of view and a really deep understanding of, why does this problem actually exist? Why hasn't it been solved yet? Why do the other ways that people try to solve this not work? Or maybe that they used to work, but the world has changed in such a way that they no longer work, or they will no longer work, or that there's a change in the world that means that there will be a much better way to solve that problem in the future, right? And without having a compelling story about that, why would anyone pay attention to you? Why would anyone that's experiencing this problem gravitate towards you? And so that's kind of the second piece. Then the third is the process. And so once you understand you have a problem, once you understand a point of view on why it exists and how to do it better, do you actually have a set of steps? Do X, Y, Z in this order, and the problem gets solved consistently in a way that works for people, in a way that creates value. And only then do you start focusing on the products, the solution, the software, the service, the marketing, the sales. Like, that's, to me, the real, if you're at the very early stages, the real focus, the real sequence. And the more focused, the more maniacal, the more obsessed I've seen entrepreneurs be about those things in that order, the faster they've become successful. And not to go back to Dan again, but like, I've seen what he's done with his most recent business, and it is such a beautiful example of elegant simplicity. Everything that is not 100% focused on solving one problem for one customer, like, it's stripped away. And it's one of the most simple businesses I've actually ever seen in my life, which is the reason it has scaled so incredibly quickly, and why it's from an economic perspective, such an attractive business. And it's a beautiful example of all the things that I'm sure Dan has learned over the years applied in this context of, like, it's so focused and it's so simple because it's focused, and simplicity is what makes it scale. Simplicity is what makes it compelling to people. Yeah, focus. That's the word.
Yeah, I know from some of the mistakes I've made with building our software, LeadSnap, like, we went really wide, and then it became really hard to manage, and then it's complex for users because they do, like, hey, I can do this. What should I do first? So it sounds like this simplicity has. I don't know the business that you're speaking of that he's scaled. Is this a software platform, or is this?
Well, I mean, he's got a lot of things going on now, but mainly his elite coaching.
Elite coaching
runs now. Yeah. So if you go follow him on Instagram and send him a DM, I'm sure you'll find out about it. But this is kind of he built SaaS Academy, installed a leadership team. They're running that now. And then as he built his personal brand, he built a new coaching company called Elite, which is for any entrepreneur, but is far more simple and focused in its execution. And I think for that reason, it is working so incredibly well.
Awesome stuff here. And you kind of hit on something, the story and the problem that we're solving. And I know for you, Marcel, you have an agency, but you also have Parakeeto. And Parakeeto specializes in helping, from my point of view, it specializes helping agencies really understand their numbers and profitability so that they can scale profitably. And I know that there's a story behind why you did this. And I would just love to understand that a little bit. Like, why was this what you did?
So it's funny because I got into it for a lot of the wrong reasons, but underneath all of that, there was one good reason, which is that I resonated with this problem. So the first business I ever ran after I quit my job at Apple and decided I want to be an entrepreneur was an agency, and we were doing real estate media. So before you could do it with your iPhone, we were creating these 3D virtual tours of houses the old school way, using a DSLR camera with a wide angle fisheye lens, taking, 20 pictures in a hotspot, stitching them together into a 3D image, loading them into 3D modeling software. Like, it was crazy amounts of work. And we had horrible unit economics, really bad profitability, because it would take us, in some cases, 30 or 40 hours to do one of these virtual tours. And real estate agents at the time in Canada on the East Coast, where houses were selling for like 150 grand, they'd give us $500, right? And so it was just, the margins were brutal. And so very early in that business, I came to terms with really trying to understand, like, okay, what are the profit margins inside of my business? What projects are we making money on? What does it cost me to hire other people to do this? Can this scale? Like, what's the cash flow look like? And I walked away from that business very early on because I realized this can never really be much more than a lifestyle business for me. It's not the vehicle that's going to get me to where I want to go. And so fast forward a few years later, I got into SaaS. I tried a couple more companies. Those failed. I got a phone call from Dan introducing me to a guy called Jared Ferguson, who's still an investor. He's still on the board today. And he said, hey, man, he ran this much bigger agency that did software, integrations for medical companies. He said, look, I spend like 2 days a week in spreadsheets trying to answer these questions that I'm asking myself every day running my agency. Are my people busy enough? Are they not busy enough? Do we need to hire? Do we need to fire? Are our clients profitable? What kind of projects or services do we make more or less money on, right? All this basic stuff. It's very simple. But in practice, really, really hard to get that information because the data is spread out all over the place. It's messy. It's not really structured properly. The way your accountant's structuring your books isn't really quite the same way that you think about your business. And so I resonated with that immediately and said, yeah, I've had this problem. But really, I thought, hey, this is a really good opportunity. I respect Jared. I respect Dan. They want me involved in this company. So this is my ticket to becoming a billionaire. So I'm going to jump on this bandwagon. And then, of course, we start talking to agency owners, and like clockwork, everyone, once you pierce through the armor of them pretending they have their shit together, you realize nobody does when it comes to this stuff. And so that was it. There's a problem here that needs to be solved. And then, 4 years of trying to figure out how to solve that problem in a way that scaled ensued. That's another story. But that's why we started on this journey. We had both felt the problem, and then everyone we talked to had it too.
Now that we've got like the framework for this, let's unpack like, how has the problem been solved? And this isn't an advertisement for Parakeeto. If you like it, I encourage you to check it out. But I want to understand, like, I run an agency. I run a marketing agency, and my numbers are hard to track. And I know a lot of our audience are struggling with this too. Actually, you know what? Let's take a step back. What do you think the biggest challenges are with marketing agencies knowing their numbers, and what are the most important numbers to know?
Yeah. So there's a story. This is the point of view. This kind of meta. We talked about the problem. Now I'm going to talk about the point of view that we have on this, which is that there was a time when you ran an agency or a consulting firm or any kind of professional services firm where the predominant way of running that business was you bill by the hour. Everybody just billed by the hour, right? So you come to me, you want me to do some work. I tell you what the hourly rate is. I do that work. I send you a bill for that amount of hours. You pay it. And then at the end, the finance team kind of stacks all the chips up and says, okay, this is how we did. Because everything was retroactive. I didn't know how much money I was going to make until after I sent you the invoice for the hours. And we didn't know the costs until after. So everything was retroactive, which works well for finance. That is what finance is. Finance is a function where once you've spent all the money, somebody sits down, counts all the beans, lines them up, and then says, okay, this is what happened in the past. And so you had this kind of linear flow of data where sales would feed into delivery would track all the time and send the invoice, and that would go to finance, and finance would give you the answers. And so historically, finance has been seen as the place where all this data ends up, and then you get the answers on how things are going. Now, what's changed is that very few agencies bill by the hour anymore, or at least of the agencies that bill by the hour, most of them are also billing on flat fees. They're doing retainers, they're doing value-based pricing, they're doing percentage of ad spend, they're doing performance-based, cost per lead. They're doing like all kinds of different billing models. And so it's not as simple as it used to be to figure out, hours multiplied by dollars equals your revenue and your costs. And so you need to take this much more integrated approach to measuring the agency's performance. And that integrated approach requires you to have data from, yes, your finance department, but also you need to have an understanding of what's going on in sales. In particular, what are you selling things for? How much time is it going to take? What was the cost going to be? What's the billing model? And hopefully have an understanding of what you expect to sell in the future. And then you need to understand your people. Who's on the team? How much do they get paid? How much time do they have available? What kind of stuff can they do? Right? Where is their time going? And those three things need to kind of come together along with time tracking data, which tells you where did the time actually go? How different was the time invested in projects than what we thought? All that stuff needs to come together. And the challenge is it's all changing every single day. Those systems don't talk to each other. So the way you set up projects in your project management tool is probably very different than the way your invoice is structured in the finance tool, which is probably very different than how the contract was structured when you sent it out to the client from the sales tool. And so how do you bring all this stuff together in a way that normalizes it, connects the dots between those things, right? That's the challenge. This integrated model, there isn't really a whole lot of technology for it. And so our solution is threefold. Number one, we have a framework. So we've defined very clearly, here are the metrics that you should track that make sense in terms of connecting your operations to your finance to your sales. So hey, if this metric in operations changes, this is what it means for sales. This is what it means for finance. That seems like an obvious thing, but if you've ever tried to do that, it could be very, very challenging to think about things in a way that's consistent. So number one is the framework. Number two is the technology. So we've built some proprietary tech that helps us actually go and grab all of this messy data from everywhere across the organization and actually take it through a process to get it cleaned up, structured consistently, normalized, make sure that it's accurate, and then load it into reports. And then the third thing that we do is we combine those two things, the framework and the technology, with our consulting. So our team is actually the one going in and doing all of that hard work of figuring out how to structure the data, keeping it clean, pulling it, transforming it on a normal basis, building your reports, and actually sitting down with you to talk about, hey, what does all this mean? What does it mean that our utilization rate's going up? What does it mean that our average billable rate on this service is going down? What does it mean that our delivery margin is below our target? What does that actually mean for the business? And what does that mean in terms of the decisions we need to make next? So clients not only get data, they get understanding and they take action. So it's really wrapping those three things together that have allowed us to adjust how agencies think about profitability to this modern context where things have gotten way more complex, but the tools and the strategies have not really caught up to that increased complexity for these small firms that don't have big teams to do this stuff for them.
Right. So Marcel, for somebody that maybe it's just at the beginning of their journey and they're not ready for, a solution like this where they're paying for consulting, what's the foundational pieces that they should put into place?
So we'll start with kind of two things. The first is everybody that runs a business hopefully has some kind of financial process in place. And the reason I say that is if you don't, it probably means you're not filing your taxes and you're going to be in trouble if you're not filing your taxes. So please file your taxes. Therefore, please do some basic accounting. And so the first thing that I would do is make a couple of tweaks to how your accounting works so that you have a lot more value from this thing that you're already spending time and money on, which is, doing bookkeeping or paying a bookkeeper to reconcile your finances. And the big thing that we want to make sure we're seeing when we look at our financials is, number one, what we call delivery margin, and separating that from, our overhead expenses and therefore our operating margin. So I'll define what that means for a little bit. Most people, when they pull up their financials from their agency, they see how much money came in from clients. Then they have this big bucket called expenses, OpEx. Then they have some profit left at the bottom. Usually the profit number at the bottom is not as much as they would like to have. And the reason for that is often unclear. So they talk to their accountant, their accountant's like, oh, well, you either need more revenue or you need fewer expenses. It's like, okay, cool. Thanks, man. But that's not very helpful, right? Like, why?
Breakthrough. The cat.
Yeah. Oh my God. I never thought about that, right? And so the problem with that is that there's not a differentiation between how much money is being spent to earn the revenue versus how much money is being spent to run the business. And those things are different. And so money spent earning the revenue is, what does it cost you to deliver the promise that you made to the client? So if you ask me, Patrick, hey, Marcel, can you build me a website? Or can you run, local SEO ads for my hair clinic? I could be like, yeah, totally. It's $10,000 a month. So if I get paid $10,000 a month to run local SEO ads, local SEO for you, how much time do I need to spend to actually do all the things that I promised you I was going to do and get you the result? And what does that time cost me? And if it costs me, let's say $5,000 to earn that $10,000, then I have a 50% delivery margin. And the goal when you look at your business as an agency is when you look at all the money that you get paid from clients and you take out the money that doesn't belong to you, right? So the Facebook advertising spend that you collect from the client and then give straight to Facebook, that's not your money. Take that out. The money that you get for backlinks, then you turn around right away and you buy backlinks with it, that's not your money. That belongs to the backlink company. So strip out all the pass-through expenses, whatever's left over. Pay attention to how much money did you spend to actually get all of that work done and therefore earn the revenue. And the goal is to spend less than 50 cents of every dollar that you get paid by clients to earn the revenue. And what that requires you to do on your profit and loss statement is isolate all these people that were paying salaries. How much of that salary is for doing client work and how much of that is for other stuff, administration, sales and marketing, running the business. Same thing with software. All the software that we're paying for, which of these tools are actually for doing client work versus running the business? We want to start to create some separation between those things so we can understand, is the problem that we are fundamentally inefficient at earning revenue? And that's most people's problem, is that the business is just not creating enough oxygen because they're not efficient at earning the revenue. Or is the problem that we just have too much overhead? We're spending too much on administrative things, sales and marketing, like whatever the case might be. That's such an important distinction. And 98% of the firms that we work with, their problem is delivery margin. And so the next thing, I can talk about is, well, how do you figure out how to improve that? What are kind of the 3 key ways of improving delivery margin? Because if you do that, everything gets easier.
So just to kind of summarize and clarify on some of this, the delivery margin sounds like it's very similar to cost of goods sold, right? Which is like,
yes.
How are they? Are they the same or how are they different?
Right. They're different in that one is official accounting language. And if you ask 10 accountants to tell you what exactly cost of goods sold is for a service business, you'll get 10 different answers. So I've created new language so I can avoid the semantic issue, right? But like some people, some accountants, actually many accountants, when we look at a profit and loss statement for an agency, they're using cost of goods sold to isolate all the pass-through expenses I talked about earlier. So the white label SEO agency, the Facebook ads, the backlinks that you're buying, they're using COGS to isolate that. And what they're not doing is differentiating between how much payroll is for delivery and how much software is for delivery. So all the payrolls in one big payroll account, all the software is in one. So there isn't really a concept of what I'm talking about here, which is delivery margin. But you're right. This should be, we should just be calling this gross margin. I wish I didn't have to use different language. The problem is when I talk about gross margin to a tax accountant or an accountant that like only does GAAP accounting, we might disagree on the definition and then it's just not productive. And most people, when they look at their P&L, the thing that's called gross profit is not what I would define as gross profit.
Right.
It's definitely not what I'm defining here as delivery margin.
So I get it. So you've created your own language so that, hey, this is delivery margin is always going to be exactly what it costs for us to deliver the product that someone has paid for. So we have some additional expenses that are not a part of delivery margin, right?
Yep.
We've got 50 cents of every dollar that's going towards delivery margin. And then we have 50 cents, which is like, we could potentially call it operations expense, or we could call it like, what's the overhead? And then, so we've got to split that last 50 cents of every dollar into the overhead type expenses and the stuff that's going to be left for the profit, right?
That's right. Yeah. And that's why the goal is to have at least, I'm saying at least a 50% delivery margin, because you can reasonably expect to spend about 30% of your income on overhead expenses. That's administration, all the payroll that goes into administration, that's software expenses, it's accountants, it's lawyers, et cetera. It's all of your sales and marketing costs, what you spend to actually go out and get clients, whether that's by running ads or sponsoring events or traveling around to conferences, whatever that might be. And if you have an office or facilities, right, it's that stuff too. It's the overhead expenses of running the business. So most firms are going to spend, usually around 30%. If they're super lean and efficient, maybe 25 or 20%. And hopefully what that means is you're left with at least a 20% profit on the bottom line. And so to the point I was making earlier, the higher you can make your delivery margin, the more optionality you have. If you have a 60 or a 70% delivery margin, you want to spend a ton of money on overhead. You want to get a sweet office. You want to hire, a billion VAs. So you only have to work 4 hours a week. You want to grow at 300% year over year and spend like 35% of your income on sales and marketing and just like hit the gas. You can do all of that and still have profit because your delivery margin is so high. So that's why we focus so much on that metric, because it tends to solve overhead problems on its own. And it gives you as a founder more choice in terms of how much of this extra cash now that this business is producing from its core engine, which is doing work for clients. How much of this cash do I want to put back into overhead? And how much do I want to keep for profit? You start to feel like you have a choice when your delivery margin is healthy. Whereas when it's not, you feel like that's just happening to you. You end up with whatever you end up with.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I love this. This is an empowering framework where we have that choice. And I think what happens with a lot, Marcel, have you ever heard of this where a business has like really high top line revenue and maybe they're not even growing, but they also don't have any profit? Does that exist in the world?
You're talking about half the people that hired us to help them. Yeah, it
Yeah.
happens a lot. And what's actually surprising is there's also a lot of businesses where even if they did everything perfectly, they hit all of their revenue targets, their team was perfectly busy and utilized, every project that they did or client that they served was perfectly on budget, they would still not make money. We've seen several businesses that are designed that way, and the founders had no idea because they had never done the math to literally just figure out, like, here's all the people on my team. Here's how many hours they have available. Here's how much we pay them. Here's how much we make for every hour of work we do on average across the things that we sell. When you add all of that up, it's like, even if everything went perfectly, this business would still not make money. It's kind of wild, but that's the importance of doing some of this math.
Absolutely. It kind of seems like you learned this lesson when you were doing the photography stuff for real estate. And maybe this is part of the motivation for creating the delivery margin, right? To make sure that, hey, let's not put ourselves in this situation and make sure the unit economics actually work, where we're making more money for everything we sell instead of losing money.
100%. And in particular, when I was in that position, starting that firm, this was, over a decade ago, you Googled this, there were no good answers, right? Nobody was really talking about this in any level of detail. And again, you would just kind of get the 10 different definitions of gross margin. And then you're left as a business owner who's not an accountant, who's not a financial professional, trying to figure out what the right answer is. And that's a very daunting place to be.
When is the appropriate time in your business to be calculating delivery margin and this type of stuff? Is it ever too early?
Yeah. So I would say that understanding what your business model looks like, you should be doing that from day -1. Like before you even start a new business that's service-based, you should do some basic math to figure out, like, okay, what does this business need to look like? What's the structure need to look like for this to be reasonably profitable? How much can I afford to pay people? How many hours do they need to work? What do we need to charge? All of that math you can do ahead of time. And in fact, we have a free tool inside of our toolkit that helps you do all of that math. You could punch in like, oh, if I hired these people and if I charge this amount and if they work this often and I spend this much on overhead, what do the numbers shake out to be? And it shows you the benchmarks and if you're above or below those benchmarks. So, shameless plug, head to parakeeto.com/toolkit. You can get free access to that. But that you should be doing from day zero. You should always understand your agency's model because it's literally the design of the business that you've created. It's the best possible outcome that you could ever expect from that business. You should know what that outcome looks like and reconcile it against, is this what I want? Is this my vision as an entrepreneur? Or do I need to change the way that my business is structured such that my vision can fit within it? So that you can never do too early. And then in terms of measuring your delivery margin, I would say that as soon as you're paying someone to do your bookkeeping and accounting, then this is not a hard thing to do as long as you can differentiate between delivery and non-delivery payroll and expenses. And so I would start doing that as early as possible. Some of the stuff that we could talk about next might be a little bit more advanced. It's something you might wait until you have a small team. You've hired a couple of employees to start measuring because they are a little bit more advanced and they don't help as much in the early days. But that's what I would say on understanding delivery margin is you should know what the business is theoretically designed to do at all times from the start.
You're kind of like engineering profitability based on delivery margin and like, hey, I've got to raise my cost. I've got to raise my prices because otherwise I won't, the economics just won't work. I think for a lot of agencies, it's kind of like, I don't know what the game is where there's like that cup of dice and you like shake it and you turn it over. At the end of the month, you look and be like, hey, what's my revenue this month? Or like, what's my profitability? What actually is left in the bank account? And we don't know, but we can actually engineer that because we control every part of that formula with the amount of money that we're willing to spend, the amount of money we're charging. All of this stuff is within our control.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's almost like, imagine you were getting in a car and you were going to go drive that car, and you didn't know how far that car could drive on a tank of gas. And you also didn't have a meter on the gas tank. You just kind of got in and started driving down the road. That's what starting a business without sitting down and figuring out the model is like. You're going to drive, and then you're just going to kind of be guessing. Do I pull over for gas? Do I not pull over? Am I going to be able to make it to the next town before I run out? Right? You have no idea if this vehicle can actually get you to where you want to go, because you never sat down to actually quantify the different pieces and what they ladder up to in terms of an outcome.
Absolutely. And I would encourage you guys, like the idea of, like Marcel hinted at, with the cost of goods sold and deciding what it is and what it's not. And there could be a similar conversation that happens for a delivery margin, but he's basically just taken that out of the accountant's hand and said, this is what this is. So the idea of categorizing things in and out of that can be, like, the first few times you do it, it can be a little confusing. And I would encourage you to have something like ChatGPT ask you questions and then answer it to try to categorize this. So for instance, like a software like ClickUp that's managing projects, for me, that would not fall into delivery margin. But for something like LeadSnap, where it's performing the actual service for the delivery of our clients, and maybe it's increasing in cost based on this. So for instance, citations, we bring on a new client, we're paying for citations. So that very much would be part of the delivery margin. Do you agree with all that, Marcel?
Yeah. So just to put some specific language to it, in the example you just gave, LeadSnap would be what I would call pass-through cost. Right. So that's a cost that, like, we can attribute it to individual clients. Every time I sign on a new client, I put them on LeadSnap. I know exactly how much extra money that's going to cost me. I could put that directly in the estimate for the client. So that would be a pass-through cost. And we would subtract that from our revenue to get to our actual agency gross income. Right. And then it sounds like ClickUp. This is a tool that your team is using to run client projects and keep them organized and task things out. That would be what we would call a delivery expense. In some agencies, we say this, like, we call this above the line versus below the line. So just to kind of define this a little bit more clearly, and I'll just, again, in the toolkit, which I plugged earlier, there's videos that break this stuff down, like, in a lot of detail. And, there's visuals, and I'm drawing on an iPad. So if you're a little confused listening to this, just know that there's more information on exactly how to kind of think through this stuff. And you can watch it over and over and over again as you do it.
That's fantastic. For me, when we're going through our books, it seems like there's kind of like two main categories of expenses that we have. One is that we're paying for people, and the second is typically we're paying for software. Those make up the bulk of our agency expenses. And I think those two categories are going to be on both sides of the line, right? Some of them are going to be the pass-through expenses, and some of them are going to be kind of these, like, what we call our OpEx, right? Where it's like, hey, these are managed kind of to run the business, and their cost doesn't increase. It's not impacted. We pay for a user of ClickUp, and based on it, like, however many clients we have, that cost doesn't go up unless we add more users.
And so I guess what I'm suggesting here is that there's really three buckets that we want to separate expenses into. One is a pass-through expense, right? So that's just, it's money that doesn't belong to you. I collect this money from the client, and it goes straight to my LeadSnap subscription for that client. It goes straight to my ads for that client. It goes straight to my, whatever it is, my WordPress hosting for that client. So those are all pass-through expenses, and we want to basically subtract those from our revenue, because that money was never ours to begin with. And then you mentioned payroll, right? Well, that all falls into OpEx, but the important thing here is we need to split that payroll into two subcategories: delivery payroll and then overhead payroll. Same thing with software. What software is for delivery? What software is for overhead? And the simplest way to do this, I've found, right, if you just want to know how we do this in practice with our clients, take your profit and loss statement out of QuickBooks, put it in a spreadsheet, and just create two columns. One that says delivery, another one that says overhead. And then for each line on your P&L, just put a percentage, right? This is 100% delivery. This is 50% delivery. This is 75% delivery. And then do the same thing in the other column. And then just multiply, do another two columns, right? All right, so we spent $100,000 on payroll. 50% of that was for delivery. So our delivery payroll is $50,000. And then you can just sum those columns and say, okay, we spent this much on delivery, we spent this much on overhead. And then you can figure out what percentage of your income was spent on each of those things and check if those ratios are healthy. Did we spend 50% or less of our income on delivery? Yes or no? Did we spend 30% or less of our income on overhead? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes to both of those questions, you're doing great.
Fantastic advice. I think that part of it really brought a lot of clarity to people listening. Well, I hope that it did, because I know that people kind of fall on two different sides of the lines. There's like, hey, I'm good with numbers. Maybe I'm not great with numbers, but I can play the guitar and I'm good at art, right? So like, hopefully you got some clarity from this kind of like beating this, because as an entrepreneur, we know success leaves clues. And one of the things is the biggest companies know their numbers. It's not that they just happen to know their numbers and they're biggest companies. They are the biggest companies because they knew their numbers and that allowed them to grow. So if you're sitting there listening to this thinking like, I don't know any of this stuff, no worries. A lot of people are in that boat, but it's up to you. If you want to go to the next level, if you want to beat this level of the video game, like this is one of the things that's going to be required at some point for you to continue to move forward and make profitable decisions. So Marcel, you hinted at something. You said, I think there was like 3 ways that we can improve our cost of delivery, right? So yeah. I know you've got a lot of frameworks and models. Can you kind of give us some instruction around that?
Yeah. So I'll try to be succinct about this. And again, I'll mention like in the toolkit, if you want to go way deeper on each of these, there's very detailed videos. But if we think about delivery margin, right? The purpose of delivery margin is to try and have the highest possible percentage of each dollar that a client pays us left over after we've delivered the work to pay for overhead and leave profit. So ultimately, the formula for this is how much income did we collect from the client? We call that AGI, agency gross income. We subtract how much we spent on delivery, and then we divide that number by agency gross income. So for example, if I made $1 million and I spent $400,000 to earn it, that means I have $600,000 left over after I've completed the work. $600,000 is 60% of the $1 million that I got paid. So I have a 60% delivery margin. So when we think about that formula functionally, there's 2 ways to improve this number. I can either charge more money and keep my costs the same, right? Or I can charge the same amount of money and lower my costs. So how do we do that? There's 3 numbers. We'll start with lowering costs. The way to lower costs is we lower something called ACPH, average cost per hour. An average cost per hour just measures for every hour that someone spends doing work on clients, what's the average cost of that time? So Patrick, if you hire somebody that makes $100,000 a year to work on your team, and they work 52 weeks a year for 40 hours a week, then they have an average cost per hour of $48. If you hire someone for $50,000, their average cost per hour is about $24, half of that, right? So the game is, how do I get less expensive people to do more of the work? And to the degree that we can do that, we will lower our average cost per hour, and therefore we'll need less payroll cost, less delivery expense to earn the same amount of revenue. So that's the first lever, is average cost per hour. Then the second one is related to how do we charge more money without changing our costs. So the second lever is utilization rate. And utilization rate asks the question of those 52 weeks a year times 40 hours, right? What percentage of that time does Patrick spend, or does this employee spend, actually doing work for clients? The higher that percentage, the more revenue I'm able to generate with that person's time. And the goal typically is to have your entire business be able to spend more than 50% of all the time that you paid for actually doing work for clients. And for most individual contributors whose whole job is to work for clients, you want to try to keep that over 75, 80% on a regular week. So that's the second lever, increase utilization. You spend more time earning client revenue. That's a good thing. And then the last piece, also related to charging more, is average billable rate. And that asks the question, how much do we earn for every hour that we spend working on clients? And the formula for that's really simple. You look at how much did we get paid, and you divide it by the number of hours we spent to get it done. So for example, if I got paid $10,000 to do something and I did it in 100 hours, I made $100 per hour. If I get that same $10,000 deliverable done in 50 hours, I make $200 per hour. And so this is kind of how this all ladders together. If I have an agency with 10 people, those 10 people each have a capacity of 2,080 hours a year. That's, the 52 multiplied by 40, right? So I have 20, let's call it 20,000 hours of capacity per year. If I have 50% of that time being spent on client work, it's about 10,000 hours. And if I spend that 10,000 hours doing work that pays me, let's call it $100 an hour, that business can do $1 million in revenue. If I was to increase my utilization from 50 to 60%, then I would have 12,000 hours at $100 an hour. That's $1.2 million a year. Salaries haven't changed. I just made an extra $200,000 in profit. And if I can keep my utilization rate at 60% and I can increase my average billable rate to even just $125 an hour, either by charging more money or spending less time to get work done, now I can do $1.5 million with that same team. And so that's the power of just tweaking utilization and average billable rate and really paying attention to, what kind of work do we make more money on average? How do we tweak our pricing? How do we get more efficient? We could take this team with the same cost and we can have it earn a lot more revenue. And the flip side of that is we can take that $1 million we were making before and just lower the cost of earning that revenue by finding less expensive people to essentially do the work. So those are kind of the three golden metrics that if you can control those and measure those, you can have a massive impact on how much money your business can make and how much profit it can create as a result.
It seems like with the way that AI and automation has come on, there's this unbelievable opportunity for us to increase these numbers, right? Where, hey, we can have our people doing more billable hours because some of the stuff that they were previously doing that, or maybe not billable, but like delivery hours, because some of the things that we were doing before can now be automated or AI can use this. How do you see this playing an impact for agencies and, business, especially businesses that are largely online?
I think AI is going to have a bunch of different impacts. Some of them will be positive. Some of them will be negative. To your point, I think in the short term, a lot of this is positive because we can get way more efficient. So if we think about the impact that AI has, I could trace impacts to all three of these metrics. So it could lower average cost per hour, and then it could take a really complex task. And with a nice, well-designed AI workflow, you could have somebody with way less experience be able to run the same process because the AI is doing all of the heavy thinking, where you can have someone really senior put their thinking into the AI and then have a junior person do that work, right? So you go from having someone that's $150,000 an hour or $150,000 a year kind of senior level strategist with a ton of experience, having most of their work done by somebody who costs a third of that. So average cost per hour, that's one. The second one is average billable rate, right? If we could take the amount of time that we used to spend writing blog copy and cut it down in half, then we can make twice as much money doing those blog posts because we could do twice as many and still earn the same amount of revenue per blog post. So that's the second lever. It can impact average billable rate. And the third one, to your point, is utilization. We could leverage a lot of things that are not earning revenue for clients, a lot of internal things, and therefore have the team spend more time doing client work. So AI can be used to impact all three of those metrics. And right now, I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the efficiency. But the other thing to keep in mind is that AI is also going to create capability for the client side. They're going to be able to do more things on their own. It's going to start to drive a lot more efficiency, and that's going to create price competition and commoditization in certain areas. So I think it is going to change the landscape in agencies and force people that, are playing the efficiency game to, in some cases, on some types of services, be in a race to the bottom. And it's going to have people that are really leaning into strategy really have to commit to that even more, because the middle ground is going to exist far less, in this future world on a lot of these services that AI could reasonably disrupt, which would be things like copywriting, website design, development, design, some of these things that we're already seeing really strong use cases for AI for. It's of course not there yet where you click a button, you have a brand new website, but we're getting pretty close to that. So I think short term, lots of profitability improvements, long term, lots of profitability disruption potentially.
You kind of hit on some of the answers to this question, but I really want to drive this home. And I know we're at the end of our time here. What would you do if you were an agency that is, hey, the short-term benefits, that's great, but how do you set yourself up for to not be in a race towards the bottom as we move forward?
So my philosophy on AI, I think there's a lot of fear mongering around AI because of all the jobs that it's going to probably disrupt. And I'm not here to say that it's not going to do that. It absolutely will do that. In the same way that the internet disrupted a bunch of jobs, in the same way that the industrial revolution disrupted a lot of jobs. And this, there's a lot of instances, these platform shifts in the world that have gotten rid of a lot of jobs. But what those all also did was they created a whole bunch of new problems that never existed before that needed to be solved, created a whole new layer of technology, created a whole new layer of opportunity. So if I'm, let's say, an SEO firm right now, it's a scary time to be an SEO company because we're all watching Google trying to kill Google before anybody else kills Google so that they can own whatever the Google killer is, right? And they think it's going to be Gemini. And so if I'm an SEO company, I'm sitting back kind of going like, oh shit, this is a little scary. Like, what does the SEO look like on the other side of this? But to the degree that you can start to look ahead of that and say, what are the new problems? What are the new opportunities that are going to be created? And position yourself to be solving those, to be providing the strategic guidance on those. That is what you can do to really set yourself up for success. And while this tide is going to come through, it's going to wash away a lot of people that aren't able to adapt to that next thing. It will, I think, reward and create a lot of demand for the ones that are able to keep up and figure out how to do SEO in this new world of, LLM chat interface based search, which is quite different than what we've been doing for the last couple of decades, right? So it's really trying to anticipate what are the new problems and can I start to position myself to solve those new problems or react quickly enough to solve those new problems. And again, it's funny, full circle. It comes all the way back to the beginning of the episode. The problem is the foundation for the business. So as long as you know where those next set of problems are going to be and you can start to solve them, you're going to be good.
I think spending more and more time thinking about that. And, sometimes when we're entrepreneurs, we really get caught in the weeds, as you were saying, is like we're just kind of like doing this, and we don't take a moment to kind of zoom out and look at all the pieces on the chessboard and say, like, is what I'm doing really taking me where I want to go, or should I be adjusting? And I think that there's a lot of people who feel like they're quitting or giving up if they pivot, but you have to do this at some point, right? You don't, like, there's companies like Blockbuster or something like that decided they weren't going to be streaming online. And, we kind of know how that plays out, and we don't want to, if you're a digital company running in a space where the digital landscape is changing so quickly, you have to make sure that you're paying attention to how the world is going to change, anticipate it, and try to solve, as Marcel said, the next set of problems. So Marcel, this was fantastic, man. Every time I speak with you, I learn so much, and I'm sure the audience is going to feel the same way. Where can somebody contact you? Yeah. Two-part question. Where can someone contact Marcel? And any final thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Connect with me there. Send me a DM. I love chopping it up in the DMs with people about agency profitability, about whatever. So that's the best place to reach out and connect with me. I'm going to, of course, restate that there is a whole bunch of free stuff that will go much deeper on everything we've talked about today at parakeeto.com/toolkit. And I think my final words of advice for people out there is the same thing that I kind of stated at the beginning. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of things changing. There's the AI tidal wave. There's a lot of changes happening in the economy. A lot of people are very scared about the future because, again, they're anticipating all of these things that could go wrong. But that's where value is created. When things go wrong, that's the opportunity to be the person that figures out how to solve those new problems. And so I just want to encourage everyone to shift their lens on all of these things, because it's very easy to get caught up in the fear. But there's another side to that. Someone is going to be there to solve this next set of problems that we can't anticipate. And I just hope that it's the people listening to this show.
Awesome. Well, I think they're going to be in a better position after the things that you've shared and the frameworks that you've laid out for us. So, Marcel, I'm so grateful to have you here and share some of your time and your wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Pat. This is fun.